Okay, I want you to imagine the absolute most annoying thing that your spouse does on a regular basis. Maybe it's leaving their trash wrappers on the counter, always losing track of time and coming home later than you expected, hanging out with that friend group that you absolutely cannot stand, eating chips in the dead of quiet while you're trying to read, inviting people into your home and giving them a grand tour while you stand by mortified at the current condition of your home. Now ask yourself, are they doing it on purpose? Surely they must be to continue to do it so frequently when you've made it very clear that it drives you absolutely crazy. And yet, how could it be possible that you still love this person more than anyone else when they are so incredibly good at pushing all of your buttons? Well, because love is a choice, not an emotion. Buckle up, because this week I am talking with my very special guests on how we can fortify and build up our marriages even when we don't always like our spouses in the moment. Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome to the Persistence in Prayer podcast hosted by Catholic mindset coach, wife, mother, educator, and speaker Kylie Hine. Kylie is passionate about helping you deepen your relationship with God through the power of prayer. This podcast is a space for high achievers who want to do it all, but also want to prioritize their spiritual life and grow in faith. Join us as we explore the beauty of persistence in prayer and the transformative impact it can have on our lives. Get ready to discover practical tips, insights, and inspiration to help you develop a daily prayer practice and cultivate a deeper sense of trust in God's plan for your life. Let's journey together towards a more fulfilled and faithful life as we invite the Holy Spirit in. Let's begin. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, I am joined by Jean and Colin MacKenzie. Jean and Colin have been happily married for 23 years and have 7 beautiful children. Together, they are dedicated to strengthening Catholic marriages and fostering community. Jean, a devoted wife and marriage counselor, understands the challenges that marriages face and the importance of finding meaningful connections in the Catholic community. She founded the Holy Union Marriage Community to provide a space for couples to deepen their faith and relationships. Colin, with 32 years in the Canadian military and a current career as a financial advisor, offers unique insights into navigating both the practical and spiritual aspects of marriage. Inspired by Our Lady of Fatima, Colin and Jean believe the ultimate battle between the divine and the forces of darkness revolves around marriages and family. Together, they offer guidance and support for couples seeking to live out their marriage vocation to the fullest. Jean and Colin, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
I'm excited for this. And for everyone listening, if you have been around this podcast from the beginning, Colin is the first male we've had as a guest. So this is going to be really fun. Going to offer a new perspective. And I often ask the guests to share about themselves. But I think since this is focused on marriage and how we navigate marriages and use those relationships to help us as high achieving women, I would love to hear how you two met.
So I took an opportunity in a summer course in 96 to take a philosophy course, and I hadn't taken any. So I took a third-year philosophy of ethics course at St. Francis Xavier University. It was a very interesting course. We started with Nicomachean ethics and worked our way up to the present. And there's a lot of discussion. It was a summer course all crammed together. We had 3 hours each day, 3 times a week, I think. And that's a long time together. And so there's this girl in the course, and she was kind of listening, and I had a group of males with me, and we were being dudes and having arguments and enjoying ourselves very much and not doing much studying. Maybe you can share your perspective on that course. I know.
Well, I'm just thinking too, I know you've talked with your audience before about temperaments, and I am very much the phlegmatic temperament, and Colin may be more of a choleric. So I don't know, Colin always says that I was like the quiet girl at the end of the table until one day they're all contradicting themselves. And I don't know, you want to tell that?
Well, I think we were studying and we'd moved on and we'd got to Kent, and I was totally disinterested, and I was fishing every morning for a lobster fisherman. And so I just didn't get my homework done. And so I was carrying on with older arguments and trying to just put a little cover on the fact that we hadn't actually read any of the Kant. Uh, and my buddies were jumping in and helping, and we were having quite a boisterous argument, but it had nothing to do with what was going on that day. And Jeannie just kind of jumped in on top of us and let us have it. And it was really great because she'd had enough by this point. There'd been weeks of this. And, we either read it or we didn't, but we tended to enjoy the argument more than the readings. And we're a bunch of guys from a non-philosophy background. So we were really enjoying the course. And Jeannie just kind of let us have it for not doing the work.
That's so funny because you brought up temperaments. And so the phlegmatic temperaments, they're very slow to react to things. So you guys must have been really just bothering her for quite some time to get her to react. And they like their structure and they do not like confrontation. So if you guys are over there arguing, that probably just pushed her over the boiling point to jump in and say something. Otherwise, phlegmatics kind of like to be invited into the conversation.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we weren't doing that. That's for sure.
Yeah, and that's gotten in the way other types too. I remember him like talk about an article he read. This is still while we were dating. He's like, "Tell me all about this article." And then he's like, "Well, what do you think?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't know. This is the first I heard about it." And he was so annoyed that I couldn't give an opinion about this thing that he was telling me about. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. If you aren't familiar with the temperaments, there's actually a podcast episode with Elizabeth Sines here where we talk about choleric husbands and phlegmatic wives because that can be, or other way around, choleric wives and phlegmatic husbands. So this will be a fun switch to hear your guys' perspectives.
Mhm.
So you work with married couples. I'd love to hear what you guys believe are the keys to happy, holy, and healthy marriages.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been working as a counselor for almost 20 years now with marriages, and yeah, I guess to put it in terms of our Catholic faith, I think it really requires that we have a strong identity of who we are in Christ, right? So we each, some of that is knowing our temperament, knowing how God made us. And when we're really secure and know ourselves well, then we're better able to communicate who we are as a person in that relationship and, work together. And we're not as, I think a lot of times we're, like I said, phlegmatics don't like that tension that comes up with arguments, but a lot of people don't, right? Maybe phlegmatics are more hesitant to enter that tension, but when we're really kind of like know ourselves well and are secure and can show up well, then we're more likely to have, or if we're both doing that anyway, we can have a more secure relationship. Obviously, there's lots of other pieces too, but I think that's a key piece to it. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, I think communication and learning to communicate was one of the earlier skills we had to really work on. Talking, waiting your turn was what I had to work on. I hate, white space or quiet time in the middle of an important conversation is like death to me. So I'm almost counting in my head while I'm waiting to jump in. And of course that's poor communication. You're kind of waiting to give your point rather than you're trying to score a point. It's the wrong kind of perspective. And that was me as a young man. And it took a long time, honestly, to even curb that because it's probably fairly natural to me. And we had to work on communicating and waiting on each other and trying to understand the other person, right? I mean, there's two people in it. And when you add Christ, you got three.
Yeah. One of the other important things, right, is including God in that relationship, recognizing it's not just two, it's that tripod there. We need, and, God's at the top and that he needs to be priority. And that takes a constant kind of shifting our focus back in that direction and recognizing that God is the source of all the grace and everything that we do in our relationship.
And whenever we get off track, there's like this years long pattern where we get off track or we get into any kind of difficulty, financial, or about kids or about anything. We always come back and we're like, well, what can we do to fix this? And then sooner or later we come to the conclusion that we have to start with prayer. And then we have to put it to prayer. Then God comes in a little more fully into whatever it is, enlightens it, probably offers us an insight that's really key to getting out of it. And then either that or it just, the knot unties itself sometimes. And those are elements of grace in our marriage. And grace has been the sign of our marriage all the time. We keep coming back to difficulties because we're human. And then eventually we have to kind of turn it over and come back to prayer. And then we come back to prayer and things go back onto the path. right? So it's a hard lesson because we want to fix things ourselves, or we want to make a plan and follow it, or we think we have the route in mind, and God laughs at our plans.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought up communication because if I think back to my marriage retreat, in the Catholic Church, you often have to do a marriage retreat or some sort of marriage prep before you are allowed to get married. And communication was the number one thing that they really hammered. And my husband and I felt so good about that because they're like, man, we are great communicators because we spent most of our dating life in the car together. We did not live in the same place and we were traveling to weddings and things. And so we would spend 3, 4 hours in the car at a time. And so there wasn't much else to do other than talk. And it made us really great communicators. So that was something we felt like, okay, we can do this. But I just want to go back over the 3 keys that you said to communication. Number 1, you said was waiting your turn. So I think that's recognizing when it's the time to speak and when it's the time to just maybe give them a minute and listen. Especially if you're choleric, you want to jump in, or if you're sanguine as well, if you know the other person's upset, you may tend to want to jump in and make them feel better immediately. And if they're melancholic, especially, they don't want you to make them feel better. They just need to feel what they feel. So I think that's great. Not keeping score. It's not a competition. Don't keep score in your marriage. And then I love this last one you said, to fix things, we have to go back to prayer. God is the third communicator in your marriage. And I think that is beautiful.
I just add one thing based on what he was saying too. And I think if we can look at our marriage as a vehicle for growth and in terms of our faith, that growth and sanctity, then that gives us a perspective that's really helpful too, because we tend to look at the problems and think, oh, there's something wrong. But if we look at those, like the trials and the joys as opportunities to grow, then there's always
Mhm.
opportunity. Right? And God will help us use that for that purpose.
Yeah, I love that. So, what advice do you give to couples when they say, I'm trying to communicate with my spouse, but they're just not listening, or it's always placing the blame on the other person? How do you help them to kind of self reflect and look at how can I be different in my marriage? And how does that help the marriage when they can kind of self reflect first?
Mhm. I think that personal responsibility is really important. If we're always focused on what the other person needs to change, then we're not changing much ourselves, right? And if we both do that, then we're in a stalemate, right? Nobody's changing because we're waiting for the other person to change the whole time. So one thing I get people to do is look at like the patterns, because we do tend to have patterns in our difficult conversations and say, okay, what is it that you're doing that's not effective? And that kind of puts the responsibility back on each person and has them reflect on that. And it is hard. Like we have these habits that build up or our natural tendencies because of our temperaments and all these different things, like our upbringing all contribute to how we communicate and the perspectives we take and all that kind of stuff. And so if you can kind of narrow it down to, well, what's one thing I'm not doing well and do that better, that can make a big difference. We tend to like focus on all the problems we need to fix and get overwhelmed. So if we can narrow down to that one thing that I'm going to try and do really well, the other thing I do to help people kind of achieve that is think of like, is there a phrase or a person that I'm trying to emulate in doing that? That could be Christ or Mary or it could be a person in your life. But yeah, I think it's that really narrowing it down, taking those baby steps and really working on to change one step at a time. But
Yeah, I love sending our brain on a mission to find something good. This is something that comes up in coaching calls, at least for me, a lot. But the negative is often so very easy to find.
yeah,
And I think back to just that reality that it's easier to be bad than it is to be good, even though we are created to be good.
right.
That's it's easier to find the negative often than it is to find the positive, wonderful things in our marriage. So when we can just reroute our brains, once we find one good thing, we can typically find more or just shift that perspective. So I think
Mhm.
that's just great advice. Thank you.
Yeah. And we identify that good thing and do more of it. That makes a difference. Like do more of the good. Don't just focus on taking out the bad. And one of the analogies I often use with couples is that, when there's weeds in the lawn, sometimes the best thing you can do is plant more grass seed. So that's like doing
Mm,
more good, right? And we push, like sometimes that pushes out some of the negative stuff. And then that energy that we get from doing that, we can use that to dig out those more troublesome or stubborn weeds. But our first step is let's increase the positive, right?
Yes, virtue breeds virtue. So if we can increase in one virtue, we actually grow in all of them. So even if it's not the virtue that's opposite of our biggest vice or our predominant fault, as long as we are growing in some kind of virtue, just like you said, planting that grass seed, it's going to help uproot some of the other vices and things.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, go ahead.
naturally when we try and follow the path of the saints as they've laid it out for us, we realize that we should be worrying about whether or not we're giving and whether we're trying the effort that we're making. So we kind of grow into a space where we can put ourselves out there and realize that we have to repair the breach, and that the breach is important, and our repair attempt is important. That means moving in and trying to do more of the right things, even if we've made the mistake, even if we caused the breach in the first place. We have to try and make the repair attempt as early as possible, and maybe just keep trying to do that. Keep trying to lay down the positive, because I think in these terms, it really does come down to your efforts are really going to matter in the end, right? And that's what God's going to see. That's what we try and do. We try and make sure that the other person knows that we love them, and then we hear what they're saying, whether or not we communicated that well 10 minutes ago. I think we may have to be trying to fix the conversation we're in, or it could be a conversation from last week. It could be things that have grown up because we've had multiple conversations about one item. And we just have to make the effort all the time. And you have to try and be honorable. You have to try and take the high moral ground and make sure that you're a good example in your family, right? So you have to lead by example in that. And the other person, if they love you and trust you, are probably going to do the same, right? I mean, and those things grow. We didn't start that way, that's for sure. But
Yeah,
yeah.
you said the word effort, and it reminds me of the catechism, and the definition of love is to will the good of another. It doesn't say to feel good about the other person.
Right.
How do feelings play into marriage conflict?
Mhm.
It's a big question. um, yeah, it's some of that comes back to that tension we were talking about before. Sometimes we're just uncomfortable with especially the negative emotions, right? So when we get uncomfortable with that, it's like we're not open to receiving what the other person is giving, I guess, right? So it's something that grows over time, right? But we have to learn to get comfortable with the emotion and recognize that, yeah, maybe sometimes we feel like we don't agree with how the other person's feeling. Well, feelings are just feelings, and that is how they feel. And rather than feel threatened by that, if we can just hear the emotions and show that we understand. That line from the Baltimore Catechism talks about how we're made to know, love, and serve God, right? So we can be with Him in the next. But I think that's a model for our marriages too. We have to know somebody well in order to love them well, and then we'll want to serve each other. But part of that knowledge is being able to be present to the other person's emotions and understand what makes them feel a certain way. And I think those emotions kind of our messages and tell us a little bit about who we are as a person, right? Or how God made us as a person. Like, this thing makes me scared, and this thing makes me angry. This is an injustice for me, and I love these things, right? And all pieces of the information about me. And again, the more we can communicate that to each other, the better we love each other. And also we tend to be less, like, take things less personally and get less defensive when we know the other person and understand their motives better.
Ooh, understanding their motives. I love that. So I heard be open to receiving what the other person is offering. So sometimes our spouse wants to give us something. They're trying to show love. Their love language might be different than ours. So just recognizing that they're trying to give us something because that's what they would want. And we're like, I don't want that. But just recognizing this is their way of showing love. So being open to receiving that. We don't have to like our spouse's response. I think that this is important. Sometimes we have, in the coaching world, we call it a manual, how we want them to respond, and it's how we expect them to respond. And when they don't respond that way, then we're upset. And so just recognizing that even though we are in a marriage, they are a different human being, and they are allowed to have their own emotions that do not align with our emotions. So how they choose to respond is out of our control, but we can still control what we are thinking about that situation. And then, just like you said, knowing the other person well and understanding their motivations, which really just segues perfectly into my next question. Listeners of this podcast are often women who have very high ideals and expectations for themselves, but also for the people around them. How does that tend to impact marriages in your experience?
Expectations? I would say expectations are the mother of all frustrations.
Ah,
But obviously we have to, excuse me, have certain expectations. But if we hold too tight to those expectations, then we're going to tend to get disappointed over and over again, right? And that can build up frustration and create a wall between us. So yeah, I guess that goes back to what we were saying before, right? If you recognize this is a different person, they might have a different way of operating and all that, and be open to how they would respond and how they can do things, and we're not going to build up that frustration quite as much, right? So we have to recognize the other person's gifts and talents too, and that they might, yeah, show up in that different way because of that.
That's why the long talks work so well, and because you need time to communicate your person, and you need time to communicate who you are, who they are, and understand them as well. And that once you know the person more, you may have your feelings probably led you here with love, and then that will grow the more that you know them. I think if you're both focused on that and you're trying to learn who the other person is, those long talks can help you to feel confidence in that. So when you get into a moment of conflict, your your instinct might be to freak out because you're not getting what you want or what you think you need. But you might give it a chance to just to sit there and understand that the other person's trying to communicate something, and then you may actually give yourself enough quiet in your head. This is the choleric guy saying, I'm going to quiet down for a second here and see if I can figure out what exactly I'm being offered here is. And sometimes it's not all that bad. And the worst thing for a cleric, of course, is to realize that they're completely in the wrong, right? And then they've jumped in with both feet, right? And you're just kind of like, oh, okay. Then you go, all right, fair. And and then try and slowly retract, because I don't retract easily either. And then we kind of start talking through it, and we can get to a space where we can understand the other person, understand what they're trying to offer, understand that they have an important perspective for us. And in the case of a marriage, the most important other person besides Christ, obviously, is the person you're married to. And so your wife or your husband is trying to communicate something to you. It's obviously really important because we're shouting. And no, not us, but other people. But occasionally. But it's important. It's an important communication, and you still need to kind of try and figure out where that communication is coming from, what they're trying to offer you, what they're trying to tell you. And maybe then you can figure out what your part in it is and what you have to do to kind of, again, coming back to healing the breach. Like, how do we get down to maybe eventually solving the problem, but for now, just at least having a good communication.
So important when we're angry or frustrated to still know that we love each other, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes that people feel that that's threatened when they're angry with each other. And if you get to that point where, no, we can be angry and still know that there's security in that relationship. And I think the other thing we talk about often, and I also tell couples, is that we have to remember we're on the same team and give each other the benefit of the doubt. I say most people don't get up in the morning and think, okay, how am I going to ruin their day today?
absolutely.
Drives them crazy. And that's what we have to remember in those moments where our expectations aren't lining up, because our tendency might be to get frustrated, or why you try to do it that way. But if we can kind of be patient, we need patience, the patience to see, oh, okay, well, what does make, like, that curiosity too, right? Curious about, well, what makes them tick, what makes them see it that way. And then that can help us get through that messy part.
And the confidence in the bond is part of that. And if you're confident that you and your wife are on the same page, that you're the team, you love each other, and that this is our endeavor, this is our striving in life, then this little argument about whatever it is will eventually be part of the past, and we'll still be a team. So it's okay to fight sometimes, and it's okay to disagree. It's okay to even have raised voices at times if it's necessary. And then you have the confidence to go through that, saying, what is the meaning of this? And what does God want me to learn from this? And, be humble. If both are humble, then you're going to get to the point where you understand how it will work itself out, or how God will give you the grace to get through it.
Amen. So, for someone who's struggling to initiate these conversations, or who maybe feels like, I thought I knew my spouse, but I don't know if I really know them. Maybe I wasn't asking the right questions. Are there any questions that are maybe go-to questions that everyone should be asking their spouse to get to know them a little better? Or even then, once they ask those questions, what kind of things should we be listening for? Sometimes we ask the question and then our brain just goes somewhere else. So what could we be asking and what could we be listening for that would maybe help our marriages be a little stronger?
Yeah, what could we be asking? Like, I always tell people that it's almost like you have to put a reporter's hat on, right? And it's like you're trying to get a story. You're trying to really understand, or like you're a method actor and you have to really understand this person to so you can play that role. There's a kind of art to asking question, and I think it's still something I'm learning and growing in, right? As we work on being curious, we grow in our ability to ask better questions. So I'd say just start with the basic questions. I don't know if any of your listeners have heard of John Gottman. He's like famous marriage researcher that he's the first person to really research marriage and what makes it work and things like that. And he talks about the need to have a detailed love map, which goes along with what we're saying about knowing each other well. But he has love map questions, and some of them are the simple things like what's your favorite color and what's your favorite meal. But then it goes a little deeper into, okay, who is your favorite relative growing up, or who is your least favorite, and what stressors are going on in your day. So I think if we start with the simple ones, then we can slowly expand our repertoire and grow in that ability.
I would just say that,
You're good at asking questions.
well, so ask questions, start with simple ones, I would say, and then you can have a conversation that may make them feel a little more comfortable about other things. Then you can ask the other question, but don't assume the answers. My great fault for many years has been to jump in and assume I've got what I wanted and run away with the answer. So move to action stages, which is probably my background and my training and a bunch of other things. But don't assume that you understand the answer. Go deeper, ask again, or ask a slightly different question. Make sure that you understand what the person is trying to say to you, and that comes with listening, which I'm not very good at. So you have to avoid the assumption, right? That you've got what you needed. Okay, she's angry about the eggs. Okay, the eggs were not fried properly today, whatever it is. I know it's probably something silly, but maybe there's a whole other issue there and you just need to go a little deeper, ask a little more. Maybe it's an entire frustration that has been building and you're only facing one piece of the problem and you think you can just fix that. And that's probably from maybe the male characteristic of trying to fix things, or maybe just the choleric disposition where you want to move to action and you don't want to sit there any longer. But the conversation itself has a lot of worth, and so some people want to be heard. So you have to make sure you give them the time. So
Yeah, I think that brings up that point of like clarifying, right? When we have the answer, let's make sure that we're understanding it the same way, right? So because we all have faulty perspectives. Our brain kind of takes little snapshots and fills in the gaps with our past experience and stuff. And so we can see or hear the same thing and it can mean something different to both of us. And we all have faulty memories too, right? We can all think we remember this exactly how it happened, but our memories aren't that accurate. So we need to remember all those things when we're communicating. But okay, so you asked what kind of questions? I'm trying to make sure we answered
Yeah. And then what should we be listening for? And I think you just said, don't assume the answers. So really listening for the answers. Colin, I thought it was interesting. You said you're thinking that you had what you needed and you're ready to move on. Cholerics don't like to waste time. So just recognizing that if you are high choleric, that you're going to have to give a little bit of time to the conversation. And it may not go as quickly as you would like, especially if you have a phlegmatic spouse, because getting put on the spot to answer a question quickly can cause an interior struggle. They need time to answer. And again, this is just knowing your spouse and knowing yourself and knowing what your natural tendencies for response are. Cholerics are prone to anger. Melancholics are prone to despair, right? We all have these different things. Sanguines want to be liked. So just recognizing these things about ourselves and being sure that we are giving our spouse our attention. That can be really difficult when you have children who are interrupting the conversation, or even your cell phone is going off from work stuff, or it's just dinging because a new sports score came up or whatever it is. So just making sure that you are creating space. And I think one of the best things I've ever heard in terms of communication, not just for marriages, but especially when we are frustrated, is if you're curious, you can't be angry. So if
Mhm.
you're coming into a conversation and you're upset about something, the more curious you can be, the less likely you are to be frustrated. And I know this is true in my own marriage. My husband is not home when he said he was going to be home. And my initial reaction, again, I have to think about the motivation. For me being choleric, it's probably because it felt like things were out of control. And that was the frustrator. For someone who's melancholic, it might be they were incredibly worried because they thought something happened, whatever
Mhm.
that is. But just recognizing that and then asking questions, because 99% of the time, it's not that he's late because he chose to be late. He's late because he was helping someone who needed help more urgently than I did. So just recognizing that and asking those questions to just diffuse our own emotions can be really helpful.
I say be curious, not furious.
Yes, I like that. Where can we go for support in our marriages? So, obviously, we have to have relationships with one another, be building time for communication. But when we're really struggling, who do we go to talk about what's going on in our marriages? I think that this sometimes we go to the wrong places. What's your suggestion?
It is really hard because if we talk to if I talk to my people, like my family or my friends are gonna take my side, right? And then the same would happen with him, right? Or that is the tendency anyway, right? And so we can create these alliances that actually these people all might be very well-meaning, but they it can cause more tension in the relationship. And so I think you need to find those people who are allies to the relationship. And that's how I approach couples counseling too. And that's one of the things that's very different about couples and individual counseling is that when I work with a couple, the relationship is the client, not the individuals. So we need those people in our life who get that and who are supportive of the relationship, and yeah, so that we can talk in that the safety, knowing that they're not going to try and kind of pull us and to create this division between us. Does that make sense?
I
Yeah.
think I think that's the importance of Christian friendship as well. Like finding groups, especially for Catholics. I think Catholic men, and they really, I don't know, that's different for girls, but like for men, it's difficult to find a good cohort of Catholic men roughly the same age who can kind of understand, who are on net, who are married, who have kids. That could be a lot of challenges stacked on top of each other to meet that kind of crew. But it can be really important for accountability. It can be really important for mentoring, right? For having a mentor or being a mentor, for having the ability to actually hang out with a bunch of guys and just talk about things and find out from better examples. If you have a male friend who happens to be Catholic and understands the same things that you do about marriage and is a great example to you, that can be a really powerful example in your life. And we've been very fortunate in that we both come from Catholic families that are still together on both sides, going all the way back as far as we know, and like the marriages are intact. So that's a great grace, and not everybody has that. But if you have a group of friends, you can kind of share those and see from each other the good things, right? And we'll see this from older couples who have been through a lot and have a lot of examples and are still intact and very strong. And you'll see it from young couples who are still bright and cheery in their love, right? And these are all good things. So I think, yes, obviously you want to be careful what you're sharing with different people, but it's also important to have um, time in a busy household with kids and things like that, some time to develop Catholic friendships. And the parish is a great place to do that because you may have an opportunity there to have people you're going to see anyways be your friends. And some of our very strongest friendships have come from there. So,
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's so important to recognize other people's. I mean, we don't just want an outsider perspective of, oh, their marriage looks wonderful and perfect, because it's probably not all perfect. I can guarantee it's not all perfect.
Yeah.
But having friendships where we can talk about our marriages and we know that their support is going to support our moral Catholic viewpoint, not going to friends who are going to jump into your emotions with you and react with you. You need someone who can just kind of say, okay, let's just take a step back. What else might be happening here and support you and listen. And I think that that's really impactful.
Mhm.
And if you don't have those people in your life, I know I didn't always have those other Catholic families around. That was something that I just didn't have. And my husband's not Catholic, so we don't get that from his side of the family. Not all of my family is still practicing Catholic.
Mhm.
So going
Yeah.
to your parish and really seeking out those friendships and praying for the Lord to bring you those friendships, I think is really, really essential. If you don't have them, pray for them, that God will place those people in your life.
We actually wrote a prayer together for friendship because that was moving around as a military family. It was hard to connect with those friends, right? And
Takes time.
and so we wrote a prayer asking God.
And we still pray it because honestly, those friendships are really important to us now, and we were so thankful that we got them. We decided to stay here where we are in Alberta because this is the place that we had those strong friendships and community and a chance for our family to grow up in a Catholic environment. So across Canada, there were some places that were great, but kind of barren or struggling, and it was better here. So that's kind of what helped us to make the decision to stay here.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. A frustration that I've heard from some women is that their spouses are not the spiritual leaders that they had hoped for.
Ugh.
How do you approach that? Either from the female side of my spouse isn't the spiritual leader that I wanted them to be. Maybe they have some really bad habits. They have some addictions. They don't have great friends. So they're going out and they're drinking all the time. And I don't like that. And then they're showing up to mass, but they're not really participating in mass. When you're not feeling like you're equally yoked, where do you approach that?
Well, from the male perspective, if it's a friend, then they need uh, they need to gain some maturity, obviously, right? I mean, these are places that we all come from. Certainly, I did from the army. I came from that perspective, non-practicing, non-Catholic, practically in the '90s. Uh, I came back to my faith through the assistance of my wife, and that became a continual shift. And it meant all those things. It meant making more time for the wife and kids, uh, who eventually I realized were actually my team, and maybe leaving some of those earlier influences and the bros and the going out and all the rest of that had to go to the wayside. And that comes with children and responsibility and the life that we want. And it is a process. It does take prayer, and you have to give them time to work on that. Now, if they have serious problems and addictions, then they need accountability. They need to find hopefully a Catholic group to help deal with that. They have to work on those things continually and on their imperfections, which will probably go on for quite some time. They got to leave some of those things behind them. They're just not good influences, and it's okay to just acknowledge that those aren't real. We can't really have those in our life if we're going to have a wife and kids, right? We need to grow up and be educated on those things. And sometimes that comes from the men in our life. Sometimes it comes from our wives in terms of their needs, because their needs should be an important factor in what we decide to do with our lives. I was certainly a workaholic in the army. And eventually I realized that my workaholism was like leaving me very little time for family and for faith. Right. So it was, when you do a hard assessment of whether or not you're actually following through on the things that you say you are, then you're not congruent. You're not aligned with what you said you're going to do. Those are hard moments for a male, for sure. If your husband needs to grow in those areas, the best way to do that probably is in the church and with a men's group, things of that nature. They can be called to those things. They can be very attractive to men. Like we have a Men of Integrity conference here that runs every year. And some of the speakers at that, just tremendous speakers who actually call out to men and call them out. And those were important moments in asking questions to myself about where I stood and what I was accomplishing. Sometimes you're accomplishing the things in life, like providing, but you're not accomplishing those spiritual leadership goals. And you have to do some of those things. That's my perspective on the male side.
Yeah, and I think all those things are important, but again, you also have to recognize as the spouse that you have no control over the other person either, right? And so if they're it's that expectation thing again too, right? So if if they're not doing those things, they're not reaching that maturity level yet, then the more you push them, the more they're likely to withdraw and pull away, right? So I think it's like God gives us free will, right? And so if we're trying to impinge on that person's free will, it doesn't usually go well. Unless they are ready to make changes, then you can support them in that. But if they're not ready, then the best thing to do is pray, which I know is hard because you have to be patient and wait for that change to happen. When we were dating, like you said, he wasn't totally into his faith, and I happened to be at Steubenville at the time and made it easier to do this. But I did a 30-day mass novena, and I could, eventually could see the fruits of that. But yeah, it's hard. That waiting game is hard. Waiting on God's time can be really hard. But yeah, it's
She got some enlightened moments too. She and her father were trapping me with books. They'd realized my weakness for books. And so good books would show up on the corner of the table and I'd steal them. And then I'd read them. And I was very sure of myself as in my positions on the church, and that I was against the church now. And that was my position in the mid-90s. And I I read more and I became educated, realized that I was completely wrong. The Saints pretty much pulled me over and said, yeah, you're not coming from the right perspective, and you don't understand, and you're not as educated as you think you are. And so I started losing arguments. I used to argue with her father because she wouldn't argue as much with me, and I'd argue with her father, and it was kind of fun. And we'd go up late arguing, right? And sometimes there'd be a scotch involved, and you'd go on quite late, and we'd argue for a long, long time. And they weren't always the most productive, but then the questions would still be there. And young men need challenge. They need to know that they can wrestle with God with confidence, and that God will provide the answers. And I came through that more and more convinced that I was on the right path, but then I still had a long, long training arc to go through to understand what my responsibilities were and what I had to do. It's a rate of constant improvement. So, but there's a lot of negative things you have to give up too, right? You have to just put those aside, and you
Yeah.
have to come to that conclusion on your own or with the grace of God.
I think when we're unequally yoked for times in our marriages too, just reflecting on what is God inviting me to grow in this time, and what is he inviting me to detach from. So just detaching from the outcome, detaching from my own timeline of when I think things should happen. So sometimes we can pray those novenas and we get to the end and the thing we were praying for that was supposed to happen didn't happen. And then we're frustrated. And it's just, that's us trying to control the narrative rather than trusting that God is still working in both of us and he's going to make it happen when it's supposed to happen. He heard all those prayers, and we can trust that he heard all those prayers and he's not going to deny that request, but he's still going to do it how he wants to do it.
right. Yeah, and we encounter the same thing with our kids too if they fall away from their faith too, right? We want them so desperately to come back, but yeah, God has his plan for them. We have to trust in that.
Yeah. One more question I have for you guys before we start to wrap up a little bit is, how do you balance, let's say you guys had 7 kids. So when we have children at home, especially, I think this can also be true if we're newly married, we don't have kids yet, but we work a lot. We're really driven. We're very wrapped up in our work. I know before my husband and I were even engaged, he had to sit me down and was like, hey, when I am here, because we only saw each other when he would drive up to Des Moines, Iowa to see me, when I am here for at least 2 hours, can you just be here? Like, you're in the room with me, but you are not with me right now because your brain is on all of these other things. You're working on your master's. You're coaching volleyball. You have 75 papers that you need to grade before tomorrow morning. I get it, but can I have an hour? And that's all I'm asking from the whole weekend. And that was a huge perspective shift for me. So back to my original question, how do we balance having that time for ourselves, because we need time for ourselves, and making time for our spouse because they also need time with us when we have kids or work and all these other factors at play. And we also need time for our relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
How do we make it work?
Well, yeah, a couple of things come to mind, but I think first of all, recognizing that time we like the self-care time and the relationship time both make us more effective at the other things that we do, right? And especially the God time too, right? So spending time with God, nurturing our relationship will open us up more to the grace of that sacrament too, right? And so we're going to be able to do the other things better, and we've kind of rejuvenated ourselves, build up our batteries. But like we just got efficient too, right? I think you have to, when you have kids and a lot of demands on your time, you need to find those little efficient ways and adjust your expectations again. Like, okay, we don't have time for a 3 or 4 hour date somewhere, but what do we have time for? You want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So we would, in the early years when we had kids all the time, like little kids everywhere, and all of the work would fall to us, then we would make sure that we'd go to the M&M's place, which is like a little, you can find
Prepared
fancier
food.
prepared food, fancier foods. You can get something fancy that you can cook in the oven in an hour. And so we'd feed the kids, and then we'd feed us. So while they're either in bed or preparing to go to bed or running around doing other things,
Or
we could
watching
sit
something.
or watching something. We could sit down for us for 45 minutes and have a nice meal together. And just 45 minutes is enough. Or we still, even now, jump out of the house, go for, you don't want a coffee late at night, but maybe a tea in the car. We have a lot of car dates, and that one, maybe that started during COVID, but like it's like, run through the drive-through and then go sit in the car, because we've always talked while in the car. And that goes back to long trips down to Steubenville and back, which didn't always go well, but there was a lot of talking, and there was a lot of communication. So car time is valuable. We still time to try and drive together to work once a week at least, so we have time to talk about us more than anything else. And then also just before bed, when you're save a little energy for then to talk and do other things. And I think the things that have to go by the wayside in a really busy household are probably the things that are extra. And after 3 kids, you realize that's mostly TV, and phones, right? That stuff has to come really second or third or fourth or seventh or eighth, right? We don't have time for all of these things, and it actually helps us, right? We have time to do the things first, and when we spend time with God, He gives us more time. I swear, that's like, if you don't spend time with God, you're gonna find yourself very busy.
Yeah, look, we tend to go to bed at the same time, but I know for some couples that can be a way. Like if they don't work on the same schedule, one's a night owl and one's a early bird, then they like just going to bed at the same time, even if the other person gets up and goes back to doing something, to spend a little time before going before the other person goes to sleep, like little things like that. You got to figure out where you can etch out that time, and even if it's just a few minutes here and there.
Yes, that's definitely true in my marriage. I get up most of the year earlier than my husband. There are times if we have a bottle calf or he works with farmers and during their busy season, during planting season, he has to be at work very, very early. He works very, very late. And so it's kind of hit and miss with schedules. So sometimes I have to sacrifice a little bit. I stay up a little later. Sometimes he sacrifices on his schedule and he gets up a little earlier, even if it's to see each other for 5 minutes. So I think being willing to make that small sacrifice, and just like you said, Colin, if we make time for God, He is going to give us time for everything else that we need to do that day. Maybe not everything we wanted to do, but
Yeah.
everything that we need to do. He really does expand time for us, and it is really beautiful. Do you guys have any favorite saints that you like to ask to intercede for marriages?
Hmm.
St. Anthony finds all my stuff, I swear,
Yes.
including my faith, probably. Um, St. Jude and St. Therese, those are always close to both of our families, I think. And
Yeah, and I like Saint Zélie and Louis Martin because they have all these children who were saints, and so I like to pray to them or ask for their intercession. Saint Saint Gianna for myself, just because she was a working mother, but she has all these beautiful letters to her husband and such. But I think we tend to kind of rotate through different saints too, depending on what's coming up in our lives. And
St. Joseph, we had one grace in our family from the very beginning. When we did the consecration to Mary according to St. Louis de Montfort at our marriage, and we've renewed it every year. And it's been just a key to bringing us together. It's a discipline. It does reorient our hearts and our prayer together and restart it. There's always a grace that comes in those 33 days. I mean, there's years we didn't even get it done, or we got sick at the end and it just, petered out. But like we have done it every year, and it's been we recognize it as the grace, and it moves us back to that moment of that initial success of getting married, and the grace that came from that, and reminds us that our Holy Mother is always with us. So like that's really powerful and important. Always say the rosary, and since COVID, we managed to maintain rosary, or at least a decade, on a daily basis. We try really hard to do that. So the saints, we always pray with the saints. We're always asking them for intercession, and we certainly try and do our rosary. So
I love that. And I also would recommend the consecration to Jesus through Mary. St. Louis Marie de Montfort's is wonderful. If your spouse isn't at a point where they are ready to do it with you, do it on your own. Pray your rosary on your own and be visible praying it. They are going to see you. And the Blessed Mother is going to intercede in wonderful, beautiful ways. I saw a significant shift in my marriage in the conversations that we were having and the way that things have come about since then, since I've started praying my daily rosary, since I've done my consecration. And so I just want to recommend that to everyone. Even if your spouse won't do it with you, do it on your own, find a friend and do it together. It's really, really beautiful. Before we get to our prayer tip to share, can you guys tell us about your new program that is launching tomorrow as of time of recording, but it will still be open when this airs? Can you go ahead and share about that?
Yeah, so that was I always get these little inspirations, but I don't know if it's a phlegmatic thing you could tell me, but I get the inspirations, but I need somebody to work with me to make them happen, right? So the inspiration this time was eventually to work with my husband. And so what I heard at Mass one day, it was like rebuild my domestic church. It was kind of like St. Francis, but it's a domestic church. I'm like, but I'm doing that. I'm helping marriages. But it kind of evolved into this idea of having an online community for Catholic couples where we could have support and have information that helped strengthen our relationships. And so our initial offering for that community is going to be a program called the Holy Union Blueprint. We're going to offer information that I've learned through all my years of working with clients and from psychology and my faith, but also we're going to add Colin's perspective of that military perspective and knowing that we are faced with battles all the time, right? And you mentioned the catechism earlier, and it's interesting. Some of the things the catechism actually mentions that we'll wrestle with infidelity and trying to dominate each other in marriage and stuff. And yet we act surprised when these things come up for us. And so some of it's about being prepared for those battles. How do we prepare ourselves, and how do we strengthen our marriages and our families so we can take on these battles going forward?
Well, and I think the perspective that we're trying to offer here is that there's a lot of tools out there within the church, and the faith has an awful lot to offer us in terms of, spiritual warfare and the things that can help make a safe place for our children and our families in this world. We're not meant to hide out from the world. We're meant to live here, and we're called to be Catholics in this moment. We're not in the wrong place. This is our battle, and we were prepared for it, and God gave us the grace to sustain. So we have to make use of that grace, transform it into a plan, enact the plan, ask for grace throughout, grow, and be strong and stand up. And that means in the household, that means in our community, that means in our larger community, in our province or our state, things of that nature. So we have to be prepared to be Catholics in the world, and we have to grow to do that, right? We can't just start from where we are and jump right into it. We should probably work on each of these things in stages. We should make sure that our family is good, and then make sure our community is good. And these can go together. And the church gives us so many tools. And I think that because we haven't necessarily had as strong a leadership as we could have, we need to know that those tools are still there. Some of them aren't being used, and we need to use the tools of prayer and the tools of community companionship to kind of stand up, to show courage, and to be, in the case of men, to be leaders in the spiritual realm as well. And we have to grow in those areas. So we have to strengthen ourselves. And that's kind of what the plan is about, is to give people tools and give them work that they can do, that they can maybe follow the saints and do some of what they've been telling us to do for centuries. I don't know why the church in this world at this time is forgetful of that, but that's probably part of somebody else's plan. So we need to take up the tools of the saints and kind of step forward.
Yeah, and so I guess the goal at the end of the course would be to have a plan for, like, each couple will be an individual for each couple, but for them to have a plan for how to keep strengthening and sustaining themselves going forward.
This is so beautiful and so needed. I think that often we forget that we can still be saints. Just because not all of the saints were married does not mean that we are not offered that same opportunity to be this living testament of God's love in the world. And so I think this is incredible work that you guys are doing, and recognizing that we shouldn't be surprised by conflict in our marriages. That's not something that we should be surprised by. And when I find conflict in my marriage or disruption, I always go back to C.S. Lewis and the Screw Tape Letters. And I think of, is that really what my husband said? Or is that what my brain told me he said? And seeking clarity, because we know that that is where the evil one attacks us. It's 100% in the mind. It's how we choose to interpret things sometimes, even if that's not the intent of our spouse. So all of this work is so needed in knowing ourselves and understanding ourselves, and really in understanding our spouses. So I will link in the show notes to your program so that everyone can check that out. I will also link your Instagram page.
Awesome.
And then I always close with the guest sharing a scripture verse or a prayer tip. And you guys had a prayer tip that you were going to share today.
Yeah, we've, again, recognizing that we're in a spiritual battle. We started regularly at bedtime. We'll say some spiritual warfare prayers together.
Yeah, and so we have gone harder at it at sometimes rather than others, but sometimes it's really important to start small and have a simple prayer that you say. We tend to say one for finances. We tend to say one for protection of our children and our families. And then there are others in the book that we're using, which is from the Catholic Exorcism site, which is Monsignor Rossetti's site, and it has prayers for the laity, which we have to stick with. So it's a super strong set of prayers, and yeah, they're totally worth it. You spend a little time on those at the end of the day, and you can have the confidence that you are protected, right, in this world when we feel spiritual attack and temptations and foolishness and distractions, and we just feel scattered sometimes, and we need to have that quiet space, to have that time to pray. We have to take that as individuals and as a couple, and we have to make sure that we use the authority that's given to us as parents and as spouses over our family. And that was important, and that was a later lesson, to realize that we have that authority within our household, 100%. And so we should use that authority to cast out things that don't belong in our house. And that's mostly on the spiritual level with prayer, but also if there was a real problem, we may have to cast things out. We may have to get rid of things from our house that are causing problems. So filters and all the other things on internets and things like that. We don't want everything in our house. So
I think that prayer also gives you the confidence and that reminder that Christ has already won salvation for us, right? The battle's won. We just have to cooperate with him.
We're cooperating with him and borrowing his authority, which he's given to us. So it's not as though we're making it up ourselves or depending on our own prayer.
Absolutely. Thank you both. You have been so absolutely wonderful. I will continue to pray for your mission.
Thank you, Kylie. It's been fun.
Thanks.
Beautiful souls, thank you again for journeying with me. If you have been blessed by this episode, it would mean the world to me if you would leave a review. Be sure to screenshot it, share it on your social media stories, and don't forget to tag me on Instagram or Facebook at Kylie M. Hine. Stay persistent in prayer, protect your peace, and as always, share the light of Christ with everyone around you.